A lonely millionaire offers 50 million for a single night with an unknown woman. A mysterious young woman appears and refuses the money without hesitation. She wanted something else. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. We continue. The Sullivan mansion rested atop the hill like an unspoken secret, its tall, somber windows reflecting only fragmented memories of a past that insisted on haunting its corridors. It was an imposing structure, built in the last century with stones imported from Europe and American hardwood, but now it carried the weight of decades of silence and guilt. The gardens, once meticulously maintained, had become wild, as if nature itself rejected proximity to the secrets the house guarded. Richard Sullivan walked through the empty halls with the precision of someone who knew every floorboard, every moan of the marble stairs. At 46, he was a man who had learned to live with ghosts. His financial empire stretched across 3 continents, built on foundations he preferred not to examine too closely. Contracts born in dark rooms, inheritances that changed hands through documents signed under pressure, relationships that ended when people asked too many questions. Richard had become a master in the art of not feeling, of transforming every emotion into strategy, every impulse into cold calculation. Women had always been part of this mathematical equation. They arrived attracted by power, by mystery, by the promise of taming the man newspapers called America's most dangerous magnate. Some lasted weeks, others just one night. Richard treated them with the same distant courtesy with which he treated his lawyers. Useful while serving a purpose, disposable when they lost relevance. None had ever managed to break through the ice barrier he had built around his heart, and he had begun to believe that this was how things should be, that this was how he deserved things to be. But on that September morning, as the San Francisco fog slowly dissolved over the city, an idea was born in his mind like a virus, an idea that would be his ruin and his salvation, though he didn't know it yet. Richard had always believed that everything had a price, that every person had a value, that anything could be bought if the amount was high enough. What if he tested this theory in a way so extreme it would shock even his own lawyers? The proposal left his mind and entered the world with the speed of a scandal. $50 million for an unforgettable night. Just one. No questions, no attachments. The words were published on his private social media profile, shared by the few contacts he maintained, and within hours spread like wildfire. All of America stopped to talk about Richard Sullivan and his obscene proposal. Newspapers condemned him with scandalous headlines. Magnate offers fortune for sex, the prostitution of the rich. Sullivan, the man who wants to buy love. Social networks exploded in furious debates. Feminists organized virtual protests. Conservatives demanded his arrest. Digital influencers began making videos speculating about who would be chosen. And, in the midst of all this media chaos, the candidates arrived. They came from all corners of the country, from all social classes with every imaginable motivation. Actresses seeking publicity, businesswomen wanting to expand their ventures, college students dreaming of a debt-free life, divorced women seeking revenge against ex-husbands. Some sent provocative photos, others wrote letters detailing exactly what they would do for 50 million. Lawyers tried to negotiate contracts, psychologists offered analyses of the traumas he surely carried. Richard's office became a chaos of proposals, blackmail, threats, and pleas. Richard observed everything from the height of his ivory tower with the same distant interest with which he watched the news. Each woman who applied only confirmed his theory about human nature. All had a price, all could be bought, all wanted something from him beyond what they were willing to give in return. It was exactly what he expected, exactly what would confirm his cynical view of the world, until she appeared. Hannah Cooper arrived on a rainy October afternoon, when the city of San Francisco was covered by low clouds that seemed to suck all color from the world. She didn't come with advisors, didn't schedule a meeting, didn't send representatives. She simply appeared at the gates of the Sullivan mansion with a handwritten letter and a look that Richard couldn't immediately decipher. 22 years old, brown hair that shined even in the rain, straight eyebrows that gave her face an almost defiant expression of determination. She wore a simple coat, carried an old book, and had around her neck an amber pendant that caught the light in a strange, almost hypnotic way. The security guard tried to dismiss her as he had done with hundreds of others, but Hannah didn't move. She stood there in the rain, getting wet with the patience of someone who had all eternity, until Richard, watching from the second-floor windows, ordered that she be let in. There was something about her that intrigued him, something he couldn't name. Perhaps it was the way she looked at him, not with the desperate hunger of others, nor with the reverent fear he was accustomed to inspiring, but with an almost scientific curiosity, as if he were a puzzle she was determined to solve. The letter she delivered had only one line, "It's not your money I want," and below, a simple signature, Hannah Cooper. No phone number, no address, no explanation. Richard held the paper between his fingers and felt for the first time in years that he had found something his money couldn't immediately buy, and that terrified him as much as it fascinated him. Richard ordered that Hannah be conducted to the main hall, the same one where he had received ministers, ambassadors, and the most powerful men in the country. But when she entered, walking with firm steps across the Italian marble floor, he realized that the environment seemed different, smaller somehow, as if her presence had altered the proportions of the space. Hannah showed no impression with the crystal chandeliers, the oil paintings on the walls, or the panoramic view of San Francisco that stretched beyond the windows. Her eyes scanned the environment with the same analytical expression she had used to study him at the gate. "Sit down," said Richard, indicating one of the imported leather armchairs. She obeyed unhurriedly, crossing her legs and resting the book she carried on her lap. It was an old edition of The Great Gatsby, the pages yellowed by time, the edges worn by handling. Richard noticed that she didn't release the volume, as if it were a talisman. "You've read my proposal," he continued, serving himself a Scottish whiskey, while she politely declined any drink with a gesture. 50 million for one night. It's an amount that could solve any financial problem you have. Buy anything you desire, secure the future of your children and grandchildren. And yet you say it's not my money you want." Hannah watched him drink, noting how he held the glass, not with the pleasure of someone who appreciates a good distilled spirit, but like someone who needs a shield between himself and the world. "Money solves many things, Mr. Sullivan, but not all, and definitely not the ones that brought me here." "And what brought you here, Hannah Cooper?" He pronounced her name slowly, testing each syllable. There was something familiar in those words, like an echo of a song he had known in dreams. She smiled for the first time since she arrived, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile people carry when they know secrets that could destroy worlds. "Curiosity," she said simply. "Curiosity about the man who believes everything can be bought, who reduces love, desire, intimacy to a commercial transaction. Do you really believe 50 million can buy an unforgettable night?" Richard laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the hall. "I believe 50 million can buy anything, any person, any experience. Love is an illusion that people use to justify their most basic instincts. In the end, we are all driven by self-interest." "Then buy me," challenged Hannah, leaning slightly forward. "Prove your theory, 50 million, one night, but I establish the rules." The glass stopped in midair halfway to Richard's lips. He studied her with renewed attention, looking for signs of bluffing, of weakness, of hidden intentions. But Hannah stared at him with the same unwavering firmness, her brown eyes shining with a determination he couldn't break. "What kind of rules?" "First," she said, raising a finger, "I am a virgin, and I chose to be. My body is not a bargaining chip. It's a sacred house that will only open to a love that burns with real meaning. If you want your unforgettable night, you'll have to make me feel something beyond financial obligation." Richard almost dropped his glass. In all his years of calculated conquests, he had never encountered a woman who declared herself a virgin at 22 by choice. Not in the world he lived in, where people lost their innocence before they even understood what it meant. "Second," continued Hannah, ignoring his shocked expression, "I stay in the mansion for as long as I deem necessary to make my decision. It could be a week, it could be a month. You will give me lodging, food, and access to any part of the house I wish to explore. No restrictions." "Impossible," said Richard immediately. "There are parts of this house that are private, that contain confidential information about my business." "Then there's no deal," replied Hannah, beginning to rise. "I'm not here to be bought in pieces, Mr. Sullivan. Either you trust me completely or you don't trust me at all." There's no middle ground. For the first time in decades, Richard found himself in a negotiation where he didn't hold all the cards. Hannah showed no need, didn't seem impressed by his power, showed no signs of wanting to please or seduce. She was offering a challenge that he didn't know if he wanted or could accept. "And third," she said, sitting back down when she realized he hadn't responded, "during this period you will also have to follow rules. No trying to impress me with expensive gifts, dinners at exclusive restaurants, or any obvious display of wealth. No trying to intoxicate me with alcohol or drugs to lower my defenses. And most importantly, no trying to force me into any physical intimacy before I'm ready." Richard finished the whiskey in one gulp, feeling the liquid burn his throat. "You're asking me to court you. I'm asking you to prove to me that you are more than a rich man trying to buy what he can't conquer," replied Hannah. "If you are indeed capable of providing an unforgettable night, you should be capable of making a woman fall in love with you without using money as an intermediary." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with tensions that neither knew how to name. Richard observed her, as if she were a work of art he couldn't interpret, while Hannah maintained her serene posture, as if she were perfectly comfortable, having just completely reformulated the terms of a game he thought he controlled. "There's one last thing," she said, touching the amber pendant on her neck. "If at the end of this period I decide you're worth it, that you can provide me with something truly unforgettable, I'll give myself completely, not just my body, but my soul, my secrets, my deepest truth. But if I decide you're just another rich man trying to buy what he can't have—" She paused, the smile returning to play on her lips. "You pay me the 50 million anyway, as compensation for having wasted my time." Richard realized he was being challenged in a way he had never experienced before. Hannah had transformed his obscene proposal into a much more dangerous bet, where he had as much to lose as she did, and for the first time in many years he felt truly alive. Richard accepted the terms with a mixture of fascination and incredulity that he couldn't completely disguise. He ordered that the guest suite in the east wing of the mansion be prepared, the one with a view of the wild gardens and far enough from his quarters that he could maintain some control over the situation. But Hannah politely refused, saying she preferred to choose her own room after getting to know the entire house. And that's how she began her methodical exploration of the Sullivan mansion, walking through the corridors with the curiosity of an archaeologist braving ancient ruins. The house revealed its secrets slowly. There were rooms that hadn't been used for decades, where furniture covered by white sheets created ghostly shapes in the penumbra. A library with thousands of books that no one read anymore, where the smell of old paper mingled with the aroma of aged wood. A conservatory with a grand piano that had once been white but was now yellowed by time, its keys covered by a thin layer of dust that betrayed years of abandonment. It was in this conservatory that Hannah decided to settle, to Richard's surprise and discomfort. She dragged a daybed near the piano, organized her few belongings in an antique dresser, and declared that this would be her room during her stay. When Richard protested, saying the place didn't have adequate heating and would be impractical for comfortable lodging, she replied that she hadn't come in search of comfort but of truth. "Do you play?" she asked, passing her fingers lightly over the dusty keys. The sound that came out was out of tune, melancholic, like a lament. "No," lied Richard, observing her from the doorframe. The truth was that he had spent years of his childhood at that same piano, forced by severe governesses to practice endless scales. But that was part of a past he preferred buried, along with all the other memories of when he still believed music could heal wounds of the soul. Hannah didn't insist, but he noticed how she looked at the instrument, not with the casual interest of someone who had never played, but with the melancholic familiarity of someone who recognized an old abandoned friend. In the days that followed, she established a routine that completely disconcerted Richard. She woke up early, even before the staff, and walked barefoot through the wild gardens, sometimes standing for long minutes contemplating the rose bushes that had grown out of control. She had breakfast alone in the kitchen, talking with the cook as if they were long-time friends. And she spent her afternoons exploring the mansion, always with her worn copy of The Great Gatsby under her arm. Richard tried to maintain his normal routine, but he found himself constantly observing her through windows, through mirrors, through any reflective surface that could capture a glimpse of her without her noticing. There was something in the way Hannah moved through the house that deeply disturbed him. She didn't walk like a visitor. She walked like someone who was returning home after a long absence. In the first week, he tried to impress her with his usual tactics, despite the rules she had established. He organized a dinner with rare wines, hired a French chef, filled the conservatory with exotic flowers. Hannah thanked him politely, ate in silence, and then asked if he always tried to buy people's emotions, or if this was a specific technique for women he wanted in his bed. "I'm trying to be a good host," he said, genuinely confused by her reaction. "You're trying to be what you think I expect you to be," replied Hannah, delicately wiping her lips with the linen napkin. "But I didn't expect anything from you, Mr. Sullivan. That's the difference between us. You live trying to exceed expectations that people don't even have." His words bothered him more than he wanted to admit. That night, instead of going to his quarters, Richard wandered around the house, unable to concentrate on work or relax with his usual distractions. That's when he heard the sound coming from the conservatory. Not music, but someone trying to coax melodies from an out-of-tune piano. Hannah was sitting on the bench, still wearing the same simple dress she had worn at dinner, trying to play a melody that he vaguely recognized. Her hands moved uncertainly over the keys, as if she knew the music by heart, but was out of practice. The result was melancholic, full of wrong notes that somehow sounded right in the heavy atmosphere of the mansion. "I thought you didn't know how to play," said Richard, entering the conservatory. Hannah didn't stop playing, but he saw her shoulders tense slightly. "I said I didn't play. Not that I didn't know how. They're different things. Why did you stop?" She finally stopped playing, her hands resting on the keys in a position that suggested years of training. "Because music is memory. And there are memories that are too dangerous to be awakened." Richard approached the piano, getting close enough to smell the subtle perfume she wore, something that reminded him of jasmine and rain. "What kind of memories?" Hannah looked at him for the first time that night, really looked at him, as if she were trying to decipher something in his expression. "Memories of when I believed people were capable of loving without wanting something in return." There was a pain in her voice that Richard recognized because it was the same he carried, though he disguised it better. "And now? Now I'm here trying to find out if you're different from all the other men I've met, or if you're just richer." Hannah stood up from the bench, smoothing her dress skirt. "So far, you're losing." She left the conservatory, leaving Richard alone with the out-of-tune piano and a strange feeling in his chest, as if something that had been dormant for years was beginning to awaken. He sat on the still warm bench where she had been, placed his hands on the keys and, for the first time in decades, played. The melody that came out was hesitant, nostalgic, a music he didn't know he still remembered. And as he played, he wondered when was the last time he had done something just because he wanted to, not because he calculated it would bring him some benefit. It was in the second week that Richard realized Hannah wasn't just exploring the mansion. She was looking for something specific. He caught her several times examining old portraits on the walls, studying family crests engraved on century-old furniture, running her fingers over Latin inscriptions that decorated the marble fireplaces. When questioned, she always changed the subject, but Richard noticed that her interest was more intense in the north wing of the house, the one that had been closed for more than 20 years. The north wing had belonged to his older brother, Daniel Sullivan, who died in a fire when Richard was only 26. Officially, it had been an accident, a forgotten candle, old curtains that caught fire, a tragedy that devastated the family. But Richard knew there was more to the story, details that the family had decided to bury along with Daniel, details that he himself preferred not to remember. Hannah had tried several times to access that wing, always finding locked doors and staff who politely redirected her to other parts of the house. But Richard saw the frustration growing in her eyes with each thwarted attempt, a determination that went far beyond the mere curiosity of a guest. "Why is the north wing closed?" she asked during one of the silent dinners they had begun to share. Richard had given up on French chefs and expensive wines, serving simple meals that she seemed to appreciate much more. "Because some doors should remain closed," he replied, methodically cutting the meat on his plate. "There are places in this house that carry memories that are better left in peace." "Memories of your brother?" Richard stopped eating, the fork suspended in the air. It was the first time she had directly mentioned Daniel, though he knew she had already asked about him to the older staff. "How do you know about my brother?" "This house speaks, Mr. Sullivan. The walls have memory, the furniture keeps secrets, the portraits tell stories. One doesn't need to be very smart to realize that there was another Sullivan living here and that something happened to him." Hannah put down her utensils and looked at him directly. "The question is, why are you so afraid to talk about him?" "I'm not afraid," said Richard automatically, but the words sounded false even to himself. "Yes, you are. You can see it in the way you avoid looking at his portraits in the main corridor, how your staff gets nervous when someone mentions the name Daniel, how you yourself have never mentioned him in all these weeks." Hannah leaned forward, her eyes shining with an intensity he couldn't decipher. "What kind of man was your brother?" Richard was silent for a long moment, fighting against the temptation to change the subject or simply leave the table. But there was something in the way Hannah looked at him, not with the morbid curiosity of someone who wants details of a tragedy, but with the compassion of someone who recognizes pain when they see it. "Daniel was," he began, then stopped, looking for the right words. "Daniel was everything I wasn't. Charismatic, generous, beloved by all. He had a natural ability to make people feel special, to make them believe he really cared about them." "And you thought he didn't care?" "I thought he cared too much," said Richard, his voice laden with an old bitterness. "Daniel saw the best in people, believed everyone had a good heart beneath the masks they wore. That made him vulnerable to being used, manipulated, betrayed by people he considered friends." Hannah observed how his hands closed into fists on the table, how a vein pulsed in his temple. "And you tried to protect him?" "I tried to warn him," corrected Richard. "There were people around him, partners, friends, even a woman he loved who were taking advantage of his generosity, who were using his trust for their own benefit. I had proof, documents that showed how they were manipulating contracts, diverting money, using the Sullivan name for schemes that could destroy our family. And he didn't believe you." Richard laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "Oh, he believed. Daniel was always intelligent, he knew I was right. But he said he preferred to be betrayed by people he loved than to live distrusting everyone like I did. He said I had become so obsessed with protecting our heritage that I had forgotten how to live." "Maybe he was right," said Hannah softly. "He died 3 days after that conversation," said Richard abruptly. "He died because I forced him to confront these people, because my need to be right was more important than his safety. If I had left things as they were, if I hadn't insisted on exposing the truth, he would still be alive." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with all the guilt that Richard had carried for more than 20 years. Hannah observed him with an expression he couldn't interpret, as if she were seeing something in him that he himself didn't know existed. "That's why you closed the North Wing," she said finally. "To not have to remember. To not have to face what I did," he corrected. "There are things in life that cannot be forgiven, Hannah. There are mistakes that are too big to be forgotten." Hannah rose from the table, went around it, and to his surprise gently placed her hand on his shoulder. It was the first physical contact between them since she had arrived at the mansion, and Richard felt as if an electric current had passed through his body. "Perhaps," she said, "it's time for you to discover that you're wrong about that too." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He walked around his quarters, drinking whiskey and trying not to think about the feeling of Hannah's hand on his shoulder, the compassion he had seen in her eyes. He couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him with tenderness, without ulterior motives, without wanting something in return. When he finally managed to fall asleep, it was to dream of Daniel, not the dead and burned Daniel who had haunted his nightmares for decades, but the living Daniel laughing, playing piano in the conservatory, while a young woman with brown hair sang along. A woman who, even in dreams, wore an amber pendant that shone like captured fire. It was on a rainy night that Hannah finally found what she was looking for. Richard had gone out for a business meeting that extended until late, and she took advantage of his absence to explore parts of the mansion she didn't yet know. The old staff had retired to their rooms, and only the night security guards patrolled the external perimeter of the property. Hannah walked through the dark corridors with the familiarity of someone who already knew every floorboard, every step that creaked. She had in her hands an old key she had found hidden behind a portrait in the library, a key she suspected would open the doors to the North Wing. Her heart beat fast, not from fear, but from an expectation she had been cultivating for weeks. The first door she tried opened with a soft click, revealing a long, dusty corridor that smelled of old furniture and forgotten memories. Hannah turned on her phone flashlight and began to walk, examining the portraits on the walls, the furniture covered by white sheets, the architectural details that were slightly different from the rest of the mansion, warmer, more personal, as if this part of the house had been designed to be lived in, not just inhabited. It was at the end of the corridor that she found what she was looking for. An office that had clearly belonged to Daniel Sullivan. The desk still had papers scattered on it, as if the occupant had left just for a few minutes. Handwritten musical scores, letters started but never finished, photographs of travels, of friends, of happy moments that dramatically contrasted with the somber atmosphere that dominated the rest of the mansion. But it was when she opened the locked drawer of the desk that she found what she had come to seek, a sealed envelope with her own name written in a delicate, feminine handwriting. "For Hannah Cooper, when the time comes," said the inscription. Inside the envelope, a 2-page letter and a photograph that made her world collapse. The letter was from her mother, Isabella Cooper, written a few days before her death, when Hannah was only 8 years old. With trembling hands, she read the words she had waited her entire life to find. "My dear Hannah, if you are reading this letter, it means you have finally found the courage to seek the truth about who you are and where you came from. Forgive me for not telling you personally, but there were forces working against us that made it impossible to keep you safe if the truth were known. You are the daughter of Daniel Sullivan, the kindest and most generous man I have ever known. We loved each other truly, deeply, but our love was impossible in the eyes of the world. I was just a housekeeper. He was the heir to an empire. When we discovered you were coming, Daniel wanted to publicly acknowledge our relationship, give you his name, raise you as a legitimate Sullivan. But there are people in this family who would do anything to keep the line of succession pure, people who see love as weakness and compassion as vulnerability. Richard Sullivan discovered our relationship and threatened us. He said that if Daniel didn't end things with me immediately, he would expose documents that could destroy the family's reputation. Documents about questionable business, about decisions Daniel had made trusting the wrong people. Richard said Daniel had to choose, me and you, or the future of the company and the Sullivan family. Daniel chose to protect us. He pretended he had ended things with me, arranged for me to work in another city, told everyone he had fired me for incompetence. But we continued to meet in secret, continued planning a future together. Daniel was gathering evidence against Richard, proof that it was he who was involved in the shady business, who was using the family name to cover up his own illicit activities. 3 days before Daniel was to present this evidence to the family council, there was the fire. It wasn't an accident, Hannah. I know because I was there that night, waiting for him at our secret meeting place. I saw who set fire to the north wing. I saw who made sure Daniel couldn't escape. If something happens to me, if I can't live to tell you this in person, I want you to know that you have rights that go beyond what anyone imagines. You are a legitimate Sullivan, daughter of the family's true moral heir. And one day, when you are strong enough, I hope you will find justice for your father and for all of us who are silenced by men who confuse power with worth." The letter ended with instructions on where to find documents that would prove her paternity, about bank accounts Daniel had opened in her name, about properties that legally belonged to her. But Hannah could barely process this practical information. Her mind was focused on a single terrible revelation. Richard Sullivan had killed her father. The photograph that accompanied the letter showed Daniel and Isabella together, she wearing the same amber pendant that Hannah carried around her neck, he with the warm smile she had seen in portraits throughout the mansion. On the back, a date, 3 months before Hannah's birth. She sat on the office floor for hours, holding the letter and the photograph, feeling as if the entire world she had known had crumbled around her. All the questions she had asked herself during childhood, about why she didn't have a father, about why her mother always got sad when she asked about her family, about why they had moved so many times in the first years of her life. Everything finally made sense. And now she was in the house of the man who had destroyed her family, who had killed her father, who had condemned her mother to a life of flight and fear. She was sharing meals with him, listening to his confessions, allowing him to touch wounds she didn't even know she had. When she finally managed to stand up, Hannah knew that everything had changed. She was no longer a curious young woman trying to understand a complex man. She was a daughter seeking justice for her dead father, and Richard Sullivan, the man who was beginning to awaken feelings she didn't want to name, was her mortal enemy. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made her quickly put away the letter and the photograph. Richard had returned from the meeting and was looking for her. Hannah closed the drawer, turned off the flashlight and left the office, locking the door behind her. When they met in the main corridor, he immediately noticed that something had changed. "Are you okay?" he asked, observing her paleness, the tension in her shoulders. "I am," lied Hannah, forcing a smile. "Just tired. It was a long day." But as they walked together back to the conservatory, she felt the weight of the truth between them like a bomb about to explode. And for the first time since she had arrived at the Sullivan mansion, Hannah didn't know if she would be strong enough to do what she had come to do. The days that followed were a refined torture for Hannah. She continued her routine in the mansion, having coffee with Richard, exploring the gardens, reading in the conservatory. But now each moment was contaminated by the terrible knowledge she carried. She observed Richard with new eyes, looking for signs of the monster her mother had described in the letter, but finding only a complex man, tormented by guilt that she now knew was much deeper than he admitted. The contradiction was destroying her inside. During the day, when Richard tried to talk with her about books, music, or simply about how she had slept, Hannah felt a dull anger burning in her chest. This man had robbed her of the chance to know her father, had condemned her mother to a life of fear, had built his empire on the bones of innocent people. But at night, when she heard him playing piano in the conservatory, because he had returned to playing, hesitant at first, but with growing confidence, she saw a man as lonely and broken as herself. Richard, in turn, felt that something fundamental had changed in Hannah, but couldn't identify what. She was still polite, still participated in conversations, but there was a new distance in her eyes, a tension that didn't exist before. Sometimes he caught her observing him with an intensity that made him feel naked, as if she could see through all the masks he wore. "You're different," he said one morning, as they had coffee on the terrace overlooking San Francisco. The city stretched below them like a sea of concrete and glass, but his attention was completely focused on the woman before him. "Different how?" asked Hannah, distractedly stirring sugar in her coffee. "More distant, as if you were here physically but your mind was elsewhere." Richard leaned forward, trying to capture her gaze. "Did I do something that bothered you?" "Say something inappropriate." Hannah finally looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made him instinctively recoil. Not anger, not disappointment, but a sadness so deep it seemed to have roots in her very soul. "You've done many inappropriate things, Richard. The question is if you have the courage to admit them." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about secrets," she said, rising from the table, "about truths that people hide to protect themselves, even when it means hurting others. I'm talking about the price we pay when we live lies for too long." Richard stood up too, a growing uneasiness taking hold of him. "Hannah, if there's something specific you want to know about me, about my family, about my past, you can ask directly. I promise to be honest with you." "Promised?" Hannah laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "You promise many things, Richard. The question is how many of them you actually keep." She left the terrace, leaving Richard alone with a growing sense of panic. Something was very wrong, but he couldn't identify what. Hannah had arrived at the mansion as a mystery, but now she seemed to be transforming into something much more dangerous, a ticking time bomb he didn't know how to defuse. That afternoon, Richard decided to confront the situation directly. He found Hannah in the conservatory, where she was sitting at the piano trying to play a melody he recognized. It was one of Daniel's unfinished compositions, a song his brother used to play when he was thoughtful or worried. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked, entering the room. Hannah didn't stop playing, but he saw her fingers tense slightly over the keys. "It's beautiful, isn't it? Melancholic, but with an underlying hope, as if the composer was trying to find light amidst darkness." "My brother composed it," said Richard, approaching the piano. "Daniel was always better than me with music. He was better than me at many things." "Tell me about him," said Hannah, finally stopping playing. "Not what you told me before. All those generalities about him being charismatic and generous. Tell me about who he really was, about what happened between you before his death." Richard felt as if the floor was moving beneath his feet. There was something in the way Hannah talked about Daniel, a familiarity that went beyond mere curiosity. "Why do you want to know about my brother?" "Because," said Hannah, turning on the bench to face him completely, "I think his death wasn't an accident, and I think you know that." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt the blood drain from his face, his hands beginning to tremble. "What are you insinuating?" "I'm not insinuating anything," said Hannah, rising from the bench. "I'm saying clearly you killed your brother. You may not have set fire to the North Wing with your own hands, but you are responsible for his death as much as if you had." Richard recoiled as if he had been punched. "How did you... Who told you this? Who are you really?" Hannah touched the amber pendant on her neck, and for the first time since he had met her, Richard saw tears in her eyes. "I am Hannah Cooper Sullivan," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "daughter of Daniel Sullivan and Isabella Cooper. I am the daughter of the man you killed." Richard's world collapsed. Each piece of the puzzle fit together with brutal clarity. The familiarity with which Hannah moved through the house, her knowledge about Daniel, the pendant he was sure he had seen before, the way she played piano. She wasn't a stranger who had appeared in his life by chance. She was the ghost of all his sins returned to collect the debt he had owed for more than 20 years. "Hannah," he began, but couldn't continue. "What do you say to the daughter of the man you betrayed? How do you ask forgiveness for having destroyed an entire family?" 22 years, she said, tears now flowing freely down her face. 22 years imagining who my father was, why my mother always cried when I asked about him, why we always lived running from something. And now I've discovered he was a good man, who wanted me, who was willing to defy his own family for me and my mother, and that you killed him because he threatened your shady business." "It wasn't like that," said Richard desperately. "Hannah, you don't understand. I didn't want him to die. I never wanted anyone to die." "But he died," shouted Hannah, all her composure finally breaking down. "He died because you couldn't accept that he was better than you, because you couldn't bear the idea that he might have something real, something true, while you only knew how to buy and sell people." Richard felt himself collapse. All his arrogance, all his control, all his certainty that he could keep the past buried, all of this evaporated before the raw pain in the eyes of Daniel's daughter. He knelt right there, in the conservatory where his brother used to play, and for the first time in decades Richard Sullivan cried. Hannah remained standing, observing Richard crumble before her. Seeing this powerful man, who commanded empires and inspired fear in businessmen throughout the country, reduced to a trembling heap of flesh and bone on the floor, should have given her satisfaction. This is what she had come to seek, to see him pay for what he had done, to see him recognize the monster he was. But instead of triumph, she felt only a terrible emptiness, as if the vengeance she had nurtured for weeks was just another illusion. "Get up," she said, her voice harder than she intended. "Stop crying and tell me the truth. The whole truth." Richard rose slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hands. When he faced her again, Hannah saw that something fundamental had changed in him. The masks had fallen completely, leaving only a broken man who had nothing more to lose. "You want the truth?" he said, his voice hoarse. "The truth is that your father was everything I never managed to be. Generous where I was calculating, confident where I was paranoid, loved where I was merely feared, and I hated him for that, as much as I loved him." Richard walked to the window, looking at the wild gardens. "When I discovered his relationship with your mother, my first reaction wasn't anger about the business or concern about the family's reputation. It was envy. Pure and simple envy that he had found something real while I collected empty relationships like trophies." "So you blackmailed him," said Hannah, crossing her arms. "Yes," admitted Richard. "I had evidence that some of his partners were using company contracts for money laundering. Daniel knew but chose to ignore it because he trusted people. I used this against him, said I would expose everything publicly if he didn't end things with your mother. And he accepted." "He pretended to accept," corrected Richard, turning to her. "But he continued seeing Isabella in secret. And worse, for me, he began investigating my own activities. He discovered that I wasn't the upright brother I pretended to be, that many of the questionable dealings I attributed to his partners were actually my initiatives." Hannah felt her stomach contract. "Continue." "Daniel found documents that proved I had been using the company for illegal operations for years. Offshore accounts, shell companies, forged contracts. He confronted me 3 days before he died, said he was going to present everything to the family council. He said I had 2 options: confess everything publicly and accept the consequences, or he would do it for me. And you chose to kill him. Richard closed his eyes, as if the memory was too physical to bear. I chose to protect myself. I hired someone to make the situation impossible for him. The original idea was just to scare Daniel, to make him understand that I wasn't bluffing about the consequences of exposing me. What kind of consequences? I told the man I hired to burn some documents in Daniel's office. Just the documents, not the entire wing. It was supposed to be a warning, a demonstration that I could destroy evidence if necessary. Richard's voice broke, but the fire spread faster than anyone expected. The old curtains, the dry wood, the wind that night. Daniel was in the office when the fire started. He couldn't get out in time. Hannah felt sick. You ordered a fire set in the wing where you knew he would be. No, shouted Richard. I didn't know he would be there. I thought he was with your mother, at the place where you used to meet. If I had known he was in the office, I would never have. He stopped, realizing how pathetic his words sounded. Would never have what? Ordered your own brother killed? How noble of you, said Hannah, sarcasm cutting like a blade. I've lived with this guilt for more than 20 years, said Richard desperately. Every day, every night, remembering his scream when he realized he couldn't get out. The way he looked at me through the smoke, understanding exactly who was responsible for what was happening. Good, said Hannah coldly. I hope that made you suffer as much as my mother suffered for the years that remained of her life. Richard approached her, but stopped when he saw Hannah back away. Your mother, is she dead? 14 years ago, from cancer, but I always knew it was from a broken heart. She never recovered from the loss of Daniel. Hannah touched the amber pendant again. This was the last gift he gave her, the only thing left from their love. Hannah, I know there's nothing I can say or do that will undo what happened. I know you must hate me more than anyone in this world, and you have every right. But you need to know that not a single day has passed that I haven't regretted what I did. Regret doesn't bring the dead back, said Hannah. It doesn't give my mother back the years she lost crying for a love that was murdered. It doesn't give me the memories with my father that you stole from me. You're right, said Richard, his voice almost a whisper. You're right about everything. I am the monster your mother said I was. I am the man who killed your father out of pure cowardice and selfishness. And now I've committed the greatest sin of all. What sin? Richard looked at her with such deep pain in his eyes that Hannah felt something break inside her chest. I fell in love with you, with the daughter of the man I killed, and I know that's one more violation, one more way to profane his memory, but I can't help it. Hannah felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. For weeks, she had fought against feelings that began as curiosity and evolved into something much more dangerous. She had convinced herself it was just strategy, a way to get close to the enemy to better destroy him. But the truth was that she had also fallen in love, with the broken man who played piano at night, with the vulnerable Richard she glimpsed in the moments when he lowered his guard. No, she said, shaking her head. No, you can't do this. You can't turn this into a violation too. I'm not trying to turn it into anything, said Richard. I'm just confessing. Because you deserve to know the whole truth, no matter how obscene it is. Hannah ran out of the conservatory, leaving Richard alone with the out-of-tune piano and the crushing weight of all the truths that had finally come to light. She ran through the corridors of the mansion, past the family portraits that she now knew included her own father, past the rooms where she had spent weeks pretending to be someone she wasn't. She only stopped when she reached the garden, where she let herself fall to her knees on the wet grass and finally allowed the pain of 22 years of unanswered questions to consume her completely. Hannah disappeared from the mansion for 3 days without leaving a trace. Richard went crazy. He sent security guards to scour all of San Francisco, hired private detectives, threatened hotel and inn staff, but no one had seen a young woman with brown hair and an amber pendant. It was as if she had evaporated, taking with her the only chance of redemption he thought he might have. During these 3 days, Richard didn't sleep, barely ate, spent hours walking through the empty corridors of the mansion like a ghost. For the first time in decades, he found himself forced to confront the absolute emptiness of his existence. Without Hannah there to observe him, challenge him, force him to be more than just an accumulator of power and money. The Sullivan mansion returned to being exactly what it had always been, an elegant mausoleum where a living dead man kept secrets that rotted his soul. It was on the third day that she returned, appearing at the main gate in the same way she had arrived the first time, alone, calm, carrying only a small bag and an expression that Richard couldn't decipher. But there was something different about her now, a quietness that seemed to come from very deep, as if she had spent these days talking with ghosts. "Where have you been?" asked Richard when he found her in the conservatory, where she had sat at the piano as if she had never left. "Looking for answers," said Hannah without looking at him, "and finding more questions. Hannah, I know you have every right to hate me, to want to see me dead, to want me to pay for everything I did. But please don't disappear like that again. If you want to punish me, torture me, do it to my face. Don't leave me wondering if you're safe." Hannah finally looked at him, and Richard saw something in her eyes that made him recoil. Not anger, not hatred, but a sadness so deep it seemed to touch the center of the earth. "Do you really care about my safety? Or just can't bear the idea of losing control over another situation?" "I care about you," said Richard, the words coming out raw and true. "I know I have no right. I know it's obscene and wrong. But I care about you more than I've cared about anyone in decades." Hannah touched some notes on the piano, a melancholic melody he didn't recognize. "I went to the cemetery where my mother is buried. I spent 2 days talking to her grave, telling her about you, about what I discovered, about—" She stopped, the words caught in her throat. "About what?" "About the fact that, against all logic and decency, I also fell in love with you." The words came out like a confession torn by force. "And that makes me hate myself as much as I hate you." The silence that followed was charged with a tension that neither knew how to handle. Richard approached slowly, as if she were a wounded animal that might flee at any sudden movement. "Hannah." "No," she said, raising her hand to stop him. "Let me finish. I came here to destroy you, to make you pay for what you did to my family. I planned everything carefully, to seduce you, to make you fall in love, and then reveal who I was at the moment when it would cause the most pain. I wanted to see you broken, humiliated, suffering as much as my mother suffered. And now?" Hannah laughed, but it was a sound without joy. "Now I've discovered that vengeance is much more complicated when you fall in love with the enemy. I've discovered that it's possible to hate and love the same person simultaneously, and that it hurts more than any physical torture." Richard knelt before her, placing his hands on the keys beside hers. "What do you want from me, Hannah? What can I do to start fixing what I broke?" "You can't fix it," she said, tears finally beginning to fall. "You can't bring my father back. You can't give my mother back the years she lost. You can't give me the childhood memories that were stolen from me. Some things can't be fixed, Richard. They can only be carried." "Then let me carry them with you," he said desperately. "Let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the forgiveness I know I don't deserve." Hannah studied him for a long moment, as if she were trying to see through all the layers of guilt and desperation to find something worth saving. "There's one last thing you need to know," she said finally. "Something I discovered in the last 3 days." "What?" Hannah opened the bag she had brought and took out some folded documents. "I went looking for the woman who took care of me after my mother died. It took 2 days to find her, but when I did, she told me something my mother never had the courage to tell me." Richard felt his stomach contract. "What did she say?" "She said you're not a legitimate Sullivan." Hannah unfolded the documents with trembling hands. "Your mother, the family matriarch, had an affair with a pianist when she was young. You are his son, not the Sullivan patriarchs. Your position in the family, your inheritance, all of it was built on a lie." Richard's world collapsed for the second time in a few days. "That's impossible." "The documents are here," said Hannah, extending the papers to him. "Certificates, DNA tests your mother did in secret, letters confessing everything. She told the housekeeper, who raised me because she was dying and couldn't take the secret to the grave." Richard took the documents with trembling hands, reading each word as if it were a death sentence. Everything made sense now. Why he had always felt different. Why music had always attracted him even when he tried to reject it. Why he had never been able to completely fit into the cold, calculating world of family business. "This means," he began. "This means that my father was the true heir of the Sullivan family," said Hannah. her voice breaking. "And that you killed the man who should have been the head of the family in your place. You killed your own nephew without even knowing." Richard let the documents fall from his hands, the weight of the final truth completely crushing him. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a usurper, an imposter who had built his entire identity on a lie. And Hannah wasn't just the daughter of the man he had killed. She was the true heir to everything he had stolen. "Now you understand," said Hannah, observing how he was falling apart before her, "why this is so impossible. Why we can't simply fall in love and pretend nothing in the past matters. You killed my father and stole my inheritance. And I fell in love with the man who destroyed my life before it even began." Richard looked at her through the tears he couldn't contain, seeing not just the woman he had fallen in love with, but Daniel's daughter, the legitimate granddaughter of the Sullivans, the person who should have been sitting where he had sat for decades. "What are you going to do?" he asked, already knowing that any answer would be his final destruction. Hannah was silent for a long time, observing Richard crumble with the final revelation. Part of her felt a dark satisfaction in seeing him confront the complete truth about who he really was, but a larger part just felt sorry for the broken man before her, for herself, for all the tragedy their families had become. "I should destroy you," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "I should expose everything publicly, take back what is rightfully mine, see you in prison for what you did. It would be justice." "It would be," agreed Richard, without raising his eyes from the floor, "and it would be less than I deserve." "But there's a problem," continued Hannah, rising from the piano bench. "If I do that, if I completely destroy you, I'll also be destroying the only chance I have to understand who my father really was. You're the last person alive who knew him intimately, the last person who can tell me about him, not just the good parts that are in my mother's letters, but everything. His flaws, his insecurities, his dreams." Richard finally looked at her, a spark of hope being born in his dead eyes. "I can tell you everything about Daniel. Every conversation, every laugh, every moment we spent together before everything went wrong." "And there's another problem," said Hannah, walking to the window. "During these weeks here, living in the house where my father grew up, sleeping in the conservatory where he composed his music, walking through the gardens where he played as a child, I began to feel connected to him in a way I never thought would be possible. And you were the one who gave me that, Richard. Even without knowing who I was, you gave me access to his memories." "Hannah, let me finish," she said, turning to face him. "I spent these 3 days trying to decide what to do with you. I visited my mother's grave, talked with the woman who raised me, walked through the city thinking of all the ways I could make you pay. And in the end, I realized something terrible." "What?" "I realized that destroying you wouldn't bring me peace. It wouldn't bring my father back. It wouldn't heal my mother's pain. It wouldn't give me the lost years of my childhood. It would just add more destruction to a story that already has too much destruction." Hannah paused, wiping a tear that ran down her face. "And I realized something even worse." Richard waited, almost without breathing. "I realized that I love you," she said, the words coming out like a forced confession. "Not the man who killed my father, not the imposter who stole my inheritance, but the man who plays out-of-tune piano at night when he thinks no one is listening. The man who carries so much guilt he can barely look at himself in the mirror. The man who is so desperate for redemption that he would be capable of anything to deserve it." "I don't deserve your love," said Richard, his voice broken. "No, you don't deserve it," agreed Hannah. "And that's the tragedy of all this. I fell in love with the man who least deserves to be loved in the world. And now I have to decide if this is a curse or an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" Hannah walked to where he was kneeling and extended her hand to help him up. "An opportunity to prove that love can be stronger than vengeance. That redemption is possible, even for someone who has done unforgivable things." Richard took her hand, feeling as if he were holding a lifeline in the middle of a stormy ocean. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm going to give you a chance," said Hannah, but her voice was firm, determined. "A single chance to prove that you can be more than the sum of your sins. But it won't be easy, Richard. It will be the hardest thing you've ever done in your life. Tell me what I need to do." Hannah walked to the table where she had left more documents she had brought with her. "First, you will transfer 70% of all your possessions to charity organizations, specifically organizations that help orphans and widows, people who have been harmed by the kind of business that you and your family have done for decades." Richard nodded without hesitation. Done. Second, you will publicly confess your involvement in my father's death. You will accept any legal consequences that come from it, including prison if that's the case. Hannah, if I go to prison, how can I— You ask me what you need to do, interrupted her. These are the conditions. You accept all of them, or you accept none. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decades of cowardice finally being confronted. I accept. Third, continued Hannah, you will spend the rest of your life trying to honor my father's memory. You will complete the musical compositions he left unfinished. You will continue the charity projects he had begun. You will be the man he would have been if you hadn't killed him. How can I be the man he would have been? I don't even know who I really am. Hannah approached him, placing her hands on his face and forcing him to look her in the eyes. You will find out, and I will help you, because despite everything, all the hatred, all the pain, all the impossibility of this situation, I believe you can become someone worthy of the love I feel for you. And if I fail, if I can't be the man you need me to be, then at least we will have tried, said Hannah, sealing the words with a soft kiss, salty from both their tears, and sometimes trying is all we have. They remained embraced in the conservatory as night fell over San Francisco, two broken hearts trying to discover if it was possible to build something whole from the fragments of what had been destroyed. It wouldn't be easy. It might even be impossible. But for the first time in decades, Richard Sullivan had a reason to believe it was worth trying. And for the first time in her life, Hannah Cooper Sullivan had someone with whom to share the weight of the memories she carried, someone who understood the pain of loss, because he had been both victim and perpetrator of it. It was a beginning. Small, fragile, built on ruins, but a beginning nonetheless. 6 months later, Richard Sullivan's public confession shocked all of America. It wasn't a formal press conference or a statement through lawyers. It was a simple video, recorded in the mansion's conservatory, where he, sitting at Daniel's piano, told the whole truth. About the illegal business, about the blackmail, about the fire that killed his brother, about decades of lies that had sustained his empire. The impact was devastating and immediate. Sullivan Corporation shares plummeted, partners broke contracts, criminal investigations were opened. Richard was arrested, prosecuted, publicly humiliated in every imaginable way. But for the first time in his adult life, he slept in peace. The truth, however painful it might be, had proven less heavy than the lies. Hannah stood by him throughout the entire process. Not as the heir who had returned to reclaim what was hers. She never publicly revealed her true identity. She stood as the woman who loved an imperfect man and was willing to help him rebuild from the rubble of his own choices. During the 18 months Richard spent in prison, Hannah transformed the Sullivan Mansion into a rehabilitation center for ex-prisoners and an orphanage for children who had lost their parents. She used the resources he had transferred to her to finance music and art projects for underprivileged youth, exactly the kind of work Daniel had dreamed of doing when he was alive. She also completed her father's unfinished musical compositions, working with conductors and musicians who had known Daniel to give life to the melodies he had left only sketched. The first concert of these songs was held in the mansion's conservatory on a rainy spring night, with Hannah at the piano and a small orchestra formed by young people who had benefited from the charity programs. Richard watched this concert through a video call from prison, crying as he recognized Daniel's musical genius, finally being acknowledged by the world. It was the first time he heard his brother's complete compositions, and he understood that Hannah had managed to do something he had never managed. She had honored Daniel's memory without destroying herself in the process. When Richard was released on a gray autumn morning, Hannah was waiting for him at the gates of the penitentiary. She was different, more mature, more serene, as if the months alone had given her a strength she didn't know she possessed. And she was pregnant. "Is it mine?" asked Richard, gently touching her already evident belly. "Ours," said Hannah, covering his hand with hers. "Conceived on the last night before your imprisonment, when we finally managed to be together without lies between us." Richard knelt right there, in front of the prison, embracing Hannah's belly and whispering apologies to the child yet to be born. Apologies for all the mistakes he had made, promises to be better than he had been, vows that this child would grow up knowing only truth and love. "What do you want the child to call me?" he asked, still kneeling. "Daddy," said Hannah simply, "because that's what you're going to be. Not the man you were, but the man you're becoming. They moved from the Sullivan mansion shortly after the birth of David. They named the boy thus in honor of the father Hannah never knew, and the uncle Richard had lost. The mansion continued functioning as a rehabilitation center and orphanage, but they needed a home that was truly theirs, not haunted by the ghosts of the past. They found a simple house in a coastal town on the California shore, far from the skyscrapers and pressure of the city. Richard got a job as a piano teacher at a local school, discovering a passion for teaching he never knew he possessed. Hannah opened a small community library, where she organized musical soirees and reading sessions for local children. It was a simple life, almost poor compared to the standards Richard had become accustomed to, but it was real in a way his previous existence had never been. They had little money, but they had peace. They had a complicated past, but they had a future built on honesty. On a summer night 2 years after the move, Hannah found Richard in the small garden of their house, teaching David, then a year and a half old, to play the first notes on a toy keyboard. The boy had Hannah's eyes, but the long, delicate hands that were a Sullivan inheritance. "He has a knack for music," said Richard when he noticed Hannah observing. "He has his grandfather's blood," said Hannah, sitting beside them on the grass. "Daniel would be proud." "Do you think he would forgive us?" asked Richard, as he did periodically, "for having found happiness amid so much tragedy?" Hannah looked at the starry sky, where she sometimes still conversed with the father she never knew, and the mother she lost too early. "I think Dad would understand that love doesn't diminish because it arises from suffering. I think he would be happy to know that his death wasn't completely in vain, that somehow it brought you back to life and gave me a family." Richard took her hand, intertwining their fingers as they had learned to do, not with the desperate passion of the first months, but with the solid tenderness of those who had chosen to build something permanent together. "I love you," he said, words that still surprised him by the simple truth they carried. "I know," said Hannah, smiling, "and I love you too, not despite what you were, but because of what you've become." Little David babbled something incomprehensible and played a random sequence of notes on the keyboard. The sound wasn't melody, not yet, but it had the promise of future music. And in that moment, sitting in the garden of the house they had transformed into a home, Richard and Hannah knew they had achieved something that seemed impossible when they met. They had transformed a story of hatred and vengeance into a story of redemption and love. They hadn't erased the past, the scars were still there, they always would be. But they had proven that it's possible to build something beautiful, even on the ruins of what was destroyed. And when David grew up, they would tell him about the grandfather he never knew, about the mistakes his father made, about how two broken people can come together and become whole. They would tell him that true love isn't one that ignores flaws, but one that chooses to love despite them, through them, because of the possibility of transformation they offer. It was a complex story for a small child to understand, but they had a lifetime to tell it, and this time it would be a true story.